Morning, guys.
Morning.
Greg, thank you very much. Fantastic stories. And really touch on a lot of what we're going to be talking about as well. Before we start, just want to say thank you to somebody that many of you in this audience might well have heard of. When we mention this name in other circles, perhaps he's not known so well, but Mathieu Ricard, hand, fantastic. His photography. When we wrote our book, The 31 Practices, and we'll explain that it's not such a big deal really, 31, we thought that it would be a lovely idea to incorporate photography somehow into the book. And guess how many chapters there are? 31. So for each chapter to have a beautiful photograph that related to the chapter title, we thought would be a cool idea. And we went down many blind alleys, but then one Sunday I was just Googling happiness, mindfulness, practices, and up pops Mathieu Ricard, who I'd never heard of. Buddhist monk, author, happens to be the translator for the French government for the Dalai Lama, and takes beautiful photographs. So we contacted his organisation, explained the project, and his people came back saying, sure, if you want to make a donation to our foundation. And so that's why we use his photography. So what we're going to be talking about today. First, we're going to share a little bit about our journey with the 31 practices. Explain why you should bother. Give you a little bit more of an underpinning in terms of the framework that supports it. So as we go through the next 30 minutes, you'll see that the principle is very, very simple. But we didn't want you to think that it was so simple that it didn't have any substance. And we're going to just tell you some stories, not quite as good as Greg's, but some stories. And then we're going to ask you to do some thinking towards the end. Before, if we've got any time, we might have some observations, comments, questions. And the reason it's not a stop button is because we hope that you will take this opportunity at the end of the 30 minutes to pause, but then maybe continue with some of the things that we've talked about. That slide was deleted. This one. So the 31 Practices originally was created for organisations. And I used to work in the hospitality sector. So I was the managing director of a Marriott hotel and country club in the UK. And they had a process that they used called their daily basics. And Richard, you'll be interested to know that they had 23, not 31. And the way that it worked was that employees throughout the world of Marriott and Ritz-Carlton focused on just one basic each day. And I realized that this was really, really powerful. And I never found out if this was true, but the urban myth was that Bill Marriott would telephone at random a hotel anywhere around the world. And at that time, there were 3,000 Marriott hotels. And whoever picked up the phone, when it was answered, he'd ask for a department at random. So it could be the kitchen or housekeeping or whatever. And then when put through, he would say, good morning, it's Bill Marriott here. Could you please tell me what the daily basic is today? And expect those people to know. So that was really the inspiration for the 31 Practices. And it really does bridge this disconnect in many organisations between what they say and then what the employees do on a day-to-day basis. One of the improvements that I felt could be made with that basics approach was, my guys used to say to me, Alan, it's the 2nd of the month, but we're on number 11. And that does my head in. So when thinking about how to develop this, I thought, well, there aren't any more than 31 days in a month, so let's do 31. And before you ask, if there aren't 31 days in the month, yes, you just skip. Another key element is that with this organisational version, the practices are co-created by the employees of the organisation, not just by the senior people in a darkened room who then tell everybody this is what you're going to do. And there's a lot of work in terms of integrating it, so it's not a comms exercise, it's not an HR project, it is an operational project. And I guess that comes from having an operational background and being frustrated with these functional projects that never actually touch and get embedded into the day-to-day. And finally, it reinforces this one-team approach. So the only reason I share this is because that's where what we're really going to be talking about now came from and originated from. And that's just a small carry card because apart from Richard, none of us could remember the 31. That was a joke.
Okay, so I'm just going to share a little bit of what sits underneath this framework. When Alan and I first met, he shared the work that he'd been doing from a very practical perspective, and he was going, but I don't really understand why it works from a theoretical perspective. So as he was talking, I was going, oh yeah, this links to this theory and this links to this aspect, and so we started to build the underpinning theory to the very practical framework. And so it's very simple. It's good because Alan and I are quite old and we have very small brains, and so simplicity helps us remember what it is we're meant to be doing. So the core from an organisation perspective are the core values. So where we start with organisations and with individuals is to help them identify their core values, but actually even before that we also build in the conversation about what's the difference in the world that happens as a result of this organisation being here. So what impact do you have on some of the critical aspects of the globe and the world and the climate and resources and people that are important? And so you're creating an emotional engagement around purpose that people can get behind and line up behind. So what's the purpose of the organisation? And then identifying the core values or principles which are going to lead people, if practiced, towards that purpose and lead the organisation to get closer to achieving that purpose. So I guess this is the organisational quest. The actions are, well, what are the practices, the daily behaviours that will bring those values to life? And then supporting organisations to build ways of assessing that. So through looking across, yes, the big measures, the KPIs, but also the stories, the everyday things that get lost when you look at the big measures. So what's shifting in the story of the organisation? And then reviewing and refreshing before going around that cycle again. So you're building an organisation that's becoming much more self-aware, much more conscious of how people are being, and you're creating the ways that some strong habits in the organisation. And this cycle is not unfamiliar to us. It's the work of Deming, it's the work of Kolb, if you think of the learning cycle. So, we're in good ground here. And then, so Alan and I met initially talking about the organisational version of 31 practices, and Alan introduced very quickly the idea of actually how do we make this accessible for individuals who, as we've heard, are living a life potentially that's very stressful, they've lost their way potentially, they've followed a path, maybe that path isn't the path that's really helping them be resourced, helping them be happy. So we wanted to create something for individuals, and so we decided that it would be good to create a very intuitive way to enable people to create their own 31 practices using a web app process. And so why? Why was our web app of 31 practices going to deal with these really big issues for people around stress and happiness and well-being? So this is a little bit more around where the theory comes in. I don't want to start there now. That's where I wanted to start last week when I put the slide together. One of the things that we know is that if we create a mindful way of being and we become attentive to what we're doing and how we're operating, then it increases our awareness. It increases our ability to accept ourselves and enables change to become who we want to be. So the 31 practices app really helps us become much more aware of how we are being and what we are doing and how that fits with who we are at the core. It helps us be aware through the sort of mind lens. So we live in an interpreted world and we create our world. There is no external reality that we would all agree on. I think we know that. So if we mindfully create a world and a meaning for ourselves, then it gives us a grounding and enables us to navigate the volatility, the uncertainty and the complexity of the world that we live in. And also if we continuously practice every day living our values, then we're building really strong habits that enable us to live a values-based life without actually that much effort whatsoever. It's just one thing a day that just maybe attending to something we wouldn't normally attend to because we reminded ourselves that actually relationships are really important to us. So I'm going to pay attention to the relationships I have with people today rather than just the task. And if we're working in a mindful and meaningful way to ourselves, then this is going to create greater awareness of and engagement with our lives. So we're paying much more attention to the day-to-day actions, to how we're being, and if we're living according to our values, we're playing to our strengths. And as the work of Martin Seligman has very clearly stated, playing to our strengths allows more opportunities for us to experience flow and flourishing and leads to a more contented base of happiness. So there are lots and lots of reasons from across philosophical, business, psychological, therapeutic practices and theories that support the idea of 31 practices. So there's a lovely complexity that sits under the simplicity that means actually why building a practice-based framework for yourself that's aligned to your values is going to lead to answering those bigger questions around reducing stress and increasing well-being and happiness.
And I think it was Leonardo da Vinci that said that simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. So we're quite pleased with that quote. Not that it was about our work. So, how it works. And just like Greg says, this app might not be the answer for you. But what I would ask you to do, please, is just consider the principles that underpin it. The reason that we went down the app route is simply that we recognise that people live their lives with their devices. And it was simply a way to make it easier for people. That was all. And we spent a long time finding the people that we wanted to work with on this, because how many people did we see that they were just interested in the technology? They weren't really interested in just making it easy for people. So what I'm going to do is just explain how it works. If, for instance, you thought that working to a daily practice was interesting, but you wanted to just type it up or keep a record on a spreadsheet or whatever, well, that's absolutely fine. So the first thing is that to have a quest is fine, but to put it into practice in this world in which we live is a lot trickier. There's so much going on that we have to contend with. And you might recognise this in your friends, not yourselves. But there is another way, and this is the way in which you can take more control. Maybe not all of the time, maybe not total control, but give yourself a better chance. And it's based on first understanding your core values, so the things that are really important to you. And the superhero there, it's finding your superhero with the V for values. And a really important part of this, which again, you'll be familiar with this, it is focusing on how I am being rather than the things that I do every day. But because we're so busy and because we're on autopilot so often, it's very easy to forget how we want to be. And if you go down the doing route, we've heard already, this is how you can end up in your prison and grateful to be there. Or you can go down the being route, where you bring together, as Alison's slide demonstrated, the heart, the mind, and the body in a way that generates amazing power. Now, another thing to say is that this is not for the faint-hearted, because it does involve some upfront investment in terms of time and work, because you can't just go like this, oh, these are my values and this is what it means to me. It's kind of an iterative process over a period of time. And it involves really looking at yourself in order to find what it is that you want to be like. But then it's a very practical tool. So it translates those core values on the left-hand side into these very practical daily behaviours, and I've explained why it's 31. So the way that it works is that, and this afternoon we've got a session where we can go into a bit more detail into how you translate the values into the practices. But very broadly, on your phone, you would get a message at the beginning of the day which reminds you of your value today and the practice that represents that value. At the end of the day, it will ask you how you've done and ask yourself to rate your performance. And you have the opportunity to record your experiences. Because again, like Alison mentioned, a lot of the time when we do stuff, we move on and we kind of forget what had happened. And so this is a great opportunity just to revisit all of the good stuff that you've done over a period of time. And shortly I mentioned some stories just to demonstrate that point. So the way that it works is this, this is the brief version, but it's based on metaphor. So if your value, if you had decided that one of your values was success, then what we would suggest that you do to stimulate your creative thinking is to consider a metaphor, your very best example of what success is. And that could be a world-class athlete, it could be a friend, it could be anything. But then what you do is identify the behaviours that you associate with that best example of success in the first place. When you've got to that stage, you then ask yourself the question, so of those behaviours that I've identified in my metaphor, which ones would I like to adopt or adapt? Which ones would I like to display to represent my value of success? And the reason we use the metaphor is it just helps you to open your mind, no more than that. And then this is a bit of a busy slide, but it just indicates some of the other features. So for instance, here you can input a quote that supports your practice, so a quote that's relevant that you like, or a video clip. So it might be that you've got a tune that you like. So it's just ways to anchor the thought of the practice in other ways. And you can set up a reward scheme. So at the end of the month, if you reach a certain score, go for lunch with a friend or take a relative to the cinema. So reward yourself. And Charles Duhigg says that the most important element of establishing habit is the reward. And ultimately, by using this process, you will find that over time, these practices that you're practicing on a day-to-day basis become embedded. And to just demonstrate this with 3 simple stories. When I first started telling people about this whole idea, I used the example of compassion and helping a stranger. So if your value was compassion, you might choose the practice, I'm going to help a stranger today. And because it's front of mind, you're much more likely to do it. So I was walking through Victoria Station in London, late for an appointment, and an old lady opened her purse. Her coins went everywhere. Now, because it was front of mind, probably, I don't know, I couldn't walk on. And so I helped her pick up the money. I gave her most of it back. She explained that she was an old age pensioner and she couldn't afford to lose this money. We had a lovely chat and I walked away feeling really good. Don't know why. Then, a couple of weeks later, I was in a tube, jam-packed, by the door, and a guy got off, taking with him somebody's earphones. Luckily, they weren't wearing them in their ears. And stepped off the train. The guy at the other side was like, he couldn't be bothered because he's like this. Doors closed. Then the train didn't leave. The doors opened. And I noticed on the platform the earphones. So I just stepped off, picked them up, back into the train, caught the eye of the guy, and just passed them across. And he was delighted. Now, I asked myself the question, if I hadn't started practicing this behaviour, would I have noticed the headphones on the platform or not? And now, the tourist, I find myself just going up to tourists looking at maps saying, can I help you? Do you know where you're going? And it feels normal now. And later in the workshop, we're going to go into that in a lot more detail.
Okay. So, in summary, I think we just very briefly, as you all know, values create a strong foundation for happiness and well-being. But successful values-based living or values-driven living does require sustained effort every day. So pay attention to it to create the habits that then become normal. And I guess I was listening to Greg's talking about his grading on his different scales. You know, the values become the scales against which you want to grade yourself. So you start to become much more rounded in how you look at what successful living is for you. And this final point, that one practice a day makes what can seem very complex very simple. And the bottom line is that if you create a practice a day that connects with your core values, that are connected to your core purpose, then this releases the power of your personal values, releases a huge energy to resource yourself, and actually just helps you navigate the world a little bit more easily. So, and if you think, actually, just thinking about it is enough, you don't need to do anything, you've got your values, you know what they'd look like in practice, but that's where you want to leave it. Here's some, as we were writing our book, we were also very keen to find some other people that said some useful things. So an ounce of practice is worth more than tons of preaching. You can't hire somebody to practice for you. You have to be the person you want to be. It's no good your executive assistant, your PA, your children being who you want you to be. And a well-known quote from Gary Player, the more I practice, the luckier I get. Knowledge is of no value unless you put it into practice. We thought we'd have someone very serious in those quotes. And this is Alan's favourite. In theory, there's no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. So, as Richard was asking who had practices in the audience, some of you saying 1, 2, 3. I just want you to reflect for a moment and not necessarily answer the question on this slide, but what would happen if you had your own set of 31 practices to bring to life your personal values every day? So thinking about the values that you've got, the practices you've got already, what impact do they have? And what impact would it have to actually create more practices? So just have a think about what the value that those practices give you, the impact they have, and maybe answer this question. And maybe just have a conversation with the person you're sitting next to for a couple of minutes about what would it be like if I had a practice every day that was linked to my core values and linked to my purpose. So just a couple of minutes. Just to draw your attention to one of the things that we want to do is to build as much collaboration and accessibility to this way of thinking as we can. And so Alan, in conversation with John Engel, who I think is here.
Where are you, John?
There you go.
This is John.
So the My 31 Practices app has a certain price attached to it. But here we want to ask you to think about what value do you attach to bringing your core values to life every day for a whole year, and to pay, if you're interested in using the app, to make a contribution that would cover the cost of My 31 Practices, but then also make a contribution to the
Haiti
to John's charity, and as a result of that, John will share what he's done with the money that is donated to him through this partnership and through your contributions. But also, we would give a free access for every person who signed up to this, who would give a complimentary version of 31 Practices, the 31 Practices app to John for him to use with teachers on the ground, or in whichever way to support the work of the charity. So just to raise your awareness of that. And the other thing is, you don't need to use the app. Alan and I had bits of paper with things typed on for a good couple of years before we actually had the opportunity to use something that was a bit more technologically complex and impressive. So anyway, enjoy your conversations.
Thank you.